So this is my video on the role of emergency management in planning and mitigating climate change and sea level rise. First off, what is climate change? It operates on the greenhouse effect, which is where naturally occurring GHGs, greenhouse gases, are in the atmosphere, and what happens is as light comes in and the planet absorbs heat, it releases a lot of that, but the greenhouse gases keep some of that heat in. So as we add more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we're keeping more heat in. That's changing the climate, raising it, and then melting sea caps, which then raises the sea level, which is what most of this presentation is going to focus on. Consequences of climate change. Of course, these aren't all of them, but there is increased flooding in coastal areas, stronger and more frequent storms, and then coastal erosion as well. If we see down here in this photo, that's a photo of a barrier island that was impacted after Hurricane Charlie in 2004, where sea level rise and then, of course, coastal erosion allowed for a strong storm surge to wash away a lot of that barrier island. Um, and then, of course, there's flooding in higher altitudes and then droughts in subtropical climates. The droughts are more relevant to us in Florida. Increased algae blooms, which we have seen in the Gulf, down here in Florida as well. So, responding to climate change, what can we do? There's two policy options, two ways to go about it. It's mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation includes efforts to prevent or minimize climate change and its consequences. So this includes a wide array of things. It could be emission controls at local levels to global levels of government. Specific limits on carbon taxes, or cap and trade systems on specific industry. It could also be tax breaks incentivizing development and or use of fossil fuel alternatives. Um, it could be regulation on car manufacturers for higher fuel standards or appliance makers for energy efficiency standards. It could also be regulation on power plants and other utility companies as well. Uh, it could be the support for mass transit so that we're eliminating carbon emissions or at least lowering them as they have that relationship with climate change. And then adaptation includes steps taken to adjust or to compensate for the effects of global climate change. So here in Florida, we have some examples of the Florida Coastal Construction Control Line program, and that helps maintain good location of barrier islands and the construction of barrier islands, or construction on barrier islands, um, to keep the coastline and fight coastal erosion. There's also dredging processes that go along with that, which would add sand to beaches from offshore to fight erosion and then protect life, property as well. Now, what stands in the way of a lot of these policy options? The strategies in either mitigation or adaptation require change in human behavior, which is hard to come about, especially in the political process. So that's one thing that stands in the way. It's alleged that a lot of these policy proposals, especially on the mitigation side, um, have an adverse economic impact. The Heritage Foundation, they said that a cap and trade system for CO2 emissions would lead to a $4.8 trillion reduction in GDP, and a loss of $3 million manufacturing jobs, as well as perceived inflation. So that's something that stands in the way as well when policymakers are talking about lowering carbon emissions as a mitigation response. And then global cooperation too. This is a global problem, and so it requires for us to make meaningful strides, the whole world, to start lowering carbon emissions and to get involved in the mitigation process. But that can be very difficult to get such a large community to be active. Um, and then, of course, there is the urge for a country to sit out of those mitigation practices in efforts to increase their upper hand advantage in the economic side of things, especially developing countries. There's an argument amongst developing countries that because global warming is a problem created by industrialization, that industrialized nations should be the ones bearing the brunt of the mitigation process. and not themselves, especially because they are still trying to develop to the same level as many developed industrialized nations. Um, and so there's competing interests as well, treaties and past beef, if you will, that could also stand in the way of future mitigation processes. And then there's the political industrial interests as well. Of course, if you are a industrial giant, you don't want to see an added cost into your business process that these mitigation processes might incur on you. And so I think a perfect example of that is the current president and our administration, um, with the firing of many scientists and the appeasing of climate change deniers, um, and the type of kind of tying being anti climate change to some kind of social identity. I think that stands in the way of mitigation processes as well. So that was my video on the state of things, and I hope you enjoyed it. These are my sources, and I will add another one in the comments that I left out.